Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, but more specifically, we are going to be discussing the Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Now, again, I know that the Bitcoin dominance videos are very dry and kind of boring, but then I ask myself, why should these videos be any different than all the other videos on my channel? And so we will carry on doing exactly the same thing that we always do. So the first thing to consider is, we look at Bitcoin dominance today, and it's just below 55%. Now, we've been doing these videos on Bitcoin dominance for about 2.5 years now, right? And it's easy to look at it on days like today and feel like it's gone down a lot, right? But when you take a step back, what you'll notice is that essentially all that is happening right now is that Bitcoin dominance is turning the prior resistance level that it held resistance at for so long, at least on weekly closes, it's now turning that into support, or at least trying to. Now, I think it will be successful in turning it into support, but of course, during the process, you have people that'll speculate that, well, what if that's the top? I don't think that Bitcoin dominance has topped out. I have said this for a long time. Now, throughout this entire uptrend in Bitcoin dominance, there has been no shortage of people trying to call the top, right, every few months. And it is difficult because, I see the accolades that people get that call for alt season. But at the end of the day, it's about saying what you think is right, even if you're wrong, right? And sometimes I say what I think is right, and I am wrong, but I live with those consequences. I will not say something that I think is wrong just because people will like me more, okay? And I mean, I could make the crazy thumbnails and the all that stuff, but at the end of the day, I don't really think it helps anyone. I think it just sort of adds to the problem that we actually have in the cryptoverse. And essentially, what it is 99.9% of the cryptocurrencies created are just not worth anything, really. I mean, they're scams, they're rug pulls. They're just cash grabs. And I mean, I know that might sound harsh, but it's true. And we saw the same. It doesn't mean that crypto is not valuable. It is. It's just that when you have a new technology like this, just like we had with the internet, when that came out back a few decades ago, you're going to have people that try to take advantage of other people by, trying to tie whatever they're doing to this, hot new topic, right? And so, if you look back at what happened, a little over 20 years ago, the tech industry went through a crazy period where so much garbage was being created, and essentially what happened is we had to go through a difficult period where a lot of that stuff, basically got churned out, and it was difficult, and it was, but it ultimately led to the success that it is today. So there's a lot of stuff in the cryptoverse right now that I do think honestly needs to get flushed out. And I mean, I think we're in the process of seeing a lot of that happen. A lot of altcoins are putting in new lows on their Bitcoin pairs. Some of them are putting in new lows on their USD pairs. But I think that the day of reckoning for the altcoin market, and again, as I've said before, the Altcoin Reckoning is the devaluation of altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs. I think it is still ongoing. I don't think it's over. And I want to explain again why. It's easy to talk about an uptrend and to ride it for a long time. And I think that, I think I'd say that we've done a pretty good job of riding this Bitcoin dominance uptrend. I mean, I really turned vocally bullish on Bitcoin dominance back over here at the beginning of 2022. And now you might say, well, Ben, I mean, it technically put in a new low over here. That's true if you include stablecoins, but if you exclude stablecoins, you will note that the actual low of Bitcoin dominance was actually in May of 2021, right? And everything after that was a higher low. And the only reason that dominance put in a lower low here was because of all the stablecoins that were being minted back then. So when you think about it, Bitcoin dominance has been going up now for 3 years, which is incredible. I mean, to think about, because if you think about excluding stables, when did it actually bottom? It bottomed in May of 2021. And now it's May of 2024. So it's essentially been going up now for 3 years, but miraculously, some people have been able to fade the entire move. So I would be careful with, all these continued top calls on Bitcoin dominance by the usual suspects. I would just say, look, there is a chance that they're right, but there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that they're not. And one of those things is the fact that, as always, as I said earlier, you essentially have prior resistance that we held resistance at for about half a year is now potentially just turning into support. We did something very similar. If you remember when we held resistance right here at this level, these wicks right here, right? This was a sort of set a high, held resistance at it there, didn't quite make it there. Again, resistance, we finally broke out. Then we went back down and tested it as support, right? So it's not like this pattern is uncommon, and it makes sense. When you see a breakout happen by Bitcoin dominance, what a lot of times happens is people are like, oh, maybe there is something to this whole Bitcoin dominance thing. And then they're like, oh crap, they're on the wrong side of the trade. So they trade their alts for Bitcoin after the breakout. And then usually what happens, and I've just gone through this so many times now, I just want to, make it clear. What usually happens is, people will sort of trade it after a big move, and then they spend the next couple of months regretting it, right? You saw that happen right here as well. We broke out, and then people are like, oh crap, he was right about Bitcoin dominance. They trade their alts for Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin dominance drops for a couple of months, and then they end up regretting it. They then convert their altcoin or their Bitcoin back to alts because they're like, oh, it's just going to go back down, and then it holds support, and then it goes back up again. And you get stuck in this cycle of, just converting it back and forth, when in reality, it was basically just a breakout, a retest, and go higher, right? A breakout, a retest, and theoretically go higher. And if you think about it, if you look at Bitcoin dominance, when it has these crazy rallies, it can often take weeks, if not months, to go on and put a new high. There's been a lot of examples, right? When we put in this high, it took about 7 weeks. When we put in this high, it took about 8 weeks. From this high to a new high, it took 16 weeks. From this one here to that one, about 6. And then from this one to the next one, I don't even know if that was a new high. That was 55.14. This was 55.26. No. So you have to go all the way out over here. That was 18 weeks, right? So you have 7, 8 weeks, 16. Here you have 6, 18. So far, we're currently 4 weeks in, right? So again, it's not a huge deal that it's taking a month for this to potentially play out, and it could still take longer. That's how long these moves have taken to play out, right? You get a big move up that a lot of people say is not going to happen, and then it does happen. The people that said it wasn't going to happen then say that's the top. They then celebrate for a couple of months as Bitcoin dominance goes down to levels they said it was never going to break above, and then it just holds support, and then it goes up again, and we just repeat the same process, right? Then they call for alt season. It doesn't happen. And it's just the same thing over and over and over again. And we have to wonder, well, at some point, theoretically, Bitcoin dominance will top. I do sometimes ride trends longer than I should, so I'm not trying to suggest that I'm going to be able to time the top exactly, but there's things that we can think about and talk about, why would we expect dominance to go up, right? And again, as I've said before, but I'll say it again just for people who are new to the channel, it all has to do with monetary policy, that thing that people pretend doesn't have an effect on crypto. Oh, it actually does. And as monetary policy is tighter and tighter, then altcoins keep on bleeding back to Bitcoin. That is just the way the cycle works. And I know some people, one common retort, and it's fair to say this, people say, well, you're only basing it on one data point, right? And essentially the data point, there's two data points. You have the balance sheet of the Fed, right? And you also have interest rates. And what you'll notice last cycle is that it actually was after the Fed cut rates. About a couple months actually after the Fed cut in July. Bitcoin dominance didn't top until September, right? So it was not until after the Fed cut rates that Bitcoin dominance topped. And it was precisely when the Fed ended quantitative tightening and pivoted to quantitative easing where Bitcoin dominance actually topped. And so last cycle, we saw those two things occur before Bitcoin dominance made a sustained shift in the other direction, right? We saw those pretty clearly play out. You had rate cuts and you had a pivot from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. And so some people would say, well, that's only one data point. But again, this goes back beyond just crypto. I mean, this is just monetary policy going back thousands of years. When you have tighter and tighter monetary policy conditions, you're just going to continue to see higher risk assets bleed to lower risk assets, right? I mean, you don't need to know what happened in 2019 to just speculate, hey guys, as rates go higher, back in 2022, 2023, as rates go higher and quantitative tightening continues, then people will probably speculate more so on the safer investments that are more likely to withstand harder economic times and likely come out stronger on the other side, even if they go down, which they probably would. Whereas the altcoin market, who knows which ones are going to survive? And you only have one Bitcoin, right? I mean, you have one Bitcoin. Well, there's 21 million, right? But you know what I mean? Like, there's one project. There's one Bitcoin, 21 million, and there's 20,000 alts, right? So it's like you have this category here, and then there's everything else. And just because you mint 20,000 new altcoins doesn't mean the dominance is going to go down. It just dilutes the money going into any individual altcoin. It's not like if you go print 10 new ERC20 tokens tomorrow, that Bitcoin dominance would go down because of that. It just means that whoever's going to fall for those rug pulls, right, they're just going to be spread out across 10 more projects as opposed to the 10,000 that already exist. So when you look at these things, it makes sense because you don't know which alts can withstand harder economic times. And again, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to predict all that when that's going to happen. But as always, normally the Fed goes too long, right? I mean, there are examples of soft landings. There's a couple of them. So always keep those in the back of your mind. But hard landings do often happen. And so if you are someone who is just sort of thinking rationally, all right, well, I want to be an investor, so where do I put my money? If you're buying crypto, right? Where do you put your money? And you can look across the space and say, well, there's Bitcoin, there's Ethereum, there's all these other altcoins. And the issue is that Bitcoin is outperforming a majority of the altcoin market. Now, of course, there are some that are outperforming Bitcoin, like I said there would be. It's not like you can't expect some to go against the trend, and the ones that mostly go against the trend are the lower market cap altcoins and also ones that were created within the last year. They don't have all the baggage from 2022. But when you think about that, I mean, it certainly makes sense, right, that people would flock to the relative safety of Bitcoin over the altcoin market. Because if there is a hard landing, or even if there's a soft landing, right, where Bitcoin goes down, it would still likely outperform or hold better than the altcoin market. Again, it doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't drop. And I know that people are going to, if Bitcoin does get a drop, which it will, I mean, at some point it will, then, if and when that happens, assuming it happens this year, then people might say, well, okay, now Bitcoin's going down. But that's the whole point, right? I mean, like, at some point, the Fed has to pivot, and the Fed's not going to pivot until economic data looks bad. And once economic data looks really bad, that's when, the blue chips of the industries start to falter. So it's the faltering of the blue chips that causes the Fed to pivot, not the faltering of the altcoin market. Okay? In fact, you could argue that the faltering of the frothiest of things, that's what they want to see happen, right? They are trying to bring us back to reality. And a lot of us degens don't want to do it, right? I mean, we'd rather just trade JPEGs all day. But if you think about it, that is what their objective is, right? They need to make tighter and tighter monetary conditions so that people are less likely to focus on these, risky, frothy things, and have them focus on providing more value to society. Again, I mean, you can go trade JPEGs if you want to, but that's the point, right? That's the point at the end of the day, is that is what they're trying to accomplish. They're trying to bring us, to rein us back in, because speculation back in 2021 got a little bit too dubious, okay? And so they're trying to rein us back in. That's the whole point of this whole thing. And they are, right? I mean, they are slowly, but I have to tip my hat. I mean, it's not like the degens aren't giving them a fight. They have been. If you were to look at, before I go to ETH Bitcoin, I want to say the other thing to look at with Bitcoin dominance here is to just simply look at the bull market support band and see that it's basically just been staying above it, since 2020. This is the end of 2022. You had one fake out right here and then one fake out in January 2023. Look at this. This fake out below it, January. This fake out below it, January. All right, I guess this one right here was late December, but maybe that wick was, early January, really late December. But same timing in terms of when the fake outs actually occurred. And so, we're still above the average of the last 20 weeks. We're still above the average of the last 8 weeks. The average of the 8-week estimate is at 54.5%. We're currently at 54.68. That doesn't mean we can't go below it. I mean, we just wicked below it last week. But again, Bitcoin dominance has been in a macro uptrend for a very long period of time. And if you look at monthly candles of Bitcoin dominance, monthly Heikin-Ashi candles that really help you identify the trend a little bit better, we haven't even had a red candle since November of 2022. And again, there are people that have faded this entire move and said that it was topping every couple of months. But again, last cycle, dominance did not top until QE occurred, and it did not top until after the first rate cut, neither of which we have seen yet. And I get that it's difficult to be patient and to watch the process play out, but it is playing out. It's playing out right in front of us. It's just taking a really long time. It's not like the Bitcoin dominance rally has been wrong. It's been right. It's just taking a long time to play out. An artifact of all the rampant money printing that occurred and all that we saw happen. Now, I mean, I do think that there is a good chance that there's going to be a pivot relatively soon. I could see the Fed pivoting sooner than the market expects. The market currently expects September, so it's possible that happens then. But in June of 2019, the Fed came out then and said that they were not going to be cutting at all in 2020 or in 2019, and then they cut the following month. So what the Fed says today, it doesn't really mean a whole lot, because they will react if a bad labor market read comes in. They will react. So that's the important thing to consider. And it's actually that exact thing which causes Bitcoin dominance to top when those bad data points come in. Because when the bad data point comes in, then QE starts to come back. When QE starts to come back, Bitcoin dominance tops, because then people are like, oh, what altcoins are on the menu? Now, the problem with that assumption is that while it's true that Bitcoin dominance would likely top under such a scenario, that doesn't necessarily mean that alt USD pairs bottom. You could still see alt Bitcoin pairs bottom and then alt USD pairs go down. That's essentially what we saw happen last cycle, right? I mean, Bitcoin dominance topped in September, but if you overlay total 3 onto the chart, total 3 still went down for a little bit after that, right? And it didn't really start to pick up until early the following year at the last rate cut, right? So the idea, generally speaking, is that alt Bitcoin pairs bottom close to the first rate cut, whereas all USD pairs bottom close to the last rate cut. And that's what we saw happen in 2019. And I think that a lot of people have sort of discounted this theory just because it's taking a long time to play out. But I think it would be a mistake to discount this view because this is exactly what happened last cycle. Now, I want to go look at ETH Bitcoin because obviously this is where a lot of the Bitcoin dominance could theoretically come from. And this is something we've been talking about for a long time, that ETH Bitcoin has broken this wick, right? And it did so a few weeks ago, and now it's just continuing to go lower, right? Right now it's slightly below 0.048. And so I do think that it's likely going to keep going down for the rest of May, off and on, and probably through June. Beyond that, I'm not that clear on how much longer it will go down. I could see a case where it goes down, a little bit longer, but I don't think it's going to last, for another year. I think the ETH Bitcoin downtrend is closer to the end than it is the beginning, but that doesn't mean you still can't have at least a couple more months of a downturn. Okay. So, I would, and in fact, last cycle in 2019, you'll see that once you had a monthly close below that wick, then you had one more red month and then one more month where it put in a new low, but it ended up being a green month. So if it were to play out in the same way, if this month closes below this wick, which none of the other months have, then maybe next month, June, is another move down, right? And then maybe July is the final move down, or maybe the final move is in June. And remember, when you look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stable coins, it's actually in June/July, oftentimes where it tops out. Okay, this was June and then slightly higher high in July. This was June. Went up a little bit later, but also you can see that in the summer months, the dominance tends to go up. And why does the dominance go up in the summer? It's because a lot of people don't care about trading crypto in the summer. They just do other things. They go on vacation. They're just not looking at the markets. And if you go look at the social risk, you can see that following the halving, the social risk has just dropped back to the 0 to 0.1 risk band, right? If it feels like no one cares, that's because no one does. If you look at the halving last cycle, it was in an uptrend. The social risk was in an uptrend. We're not in an uptrend right now. I mean, we're just going back down, and this is something I've been warning about, right? I mean, people were saying that alt season would occur after the halving because that's when it occurred last time. But last time after the halving, ETH Bitcoin was already in a macro uptrend, and it had been in a macro uptrend for like 6 or 7 months because it had bottomed in September of 2019. So if you look at like ETH Bitcoin and you go back to last cycle at the halving was in May of 2020. So the halving was right here. Yes, alts did well, but ETH Bitcoin was also in an uptrend. But ETH Bitcoin was in an uptrend not because of the halving. It was in an uptrend because the Fed had pivoted to quantitative easing, right? If the Fed's printing money, then guess what? Higher risk assets do well against lower risk assets. You see, I mean, QE started, so ETH Bitcoin was doing well. Here, QE has not started, and so ETH Bitcoin just keeps on bleeding. I mean, it's down here for the last 2.5 years. So it's been going on a long time, right? And I think that ultimately ETH Bitcoin is going to bottom to around the 0.03 to 0.04 range. Some people are calling for the lows to already be in. And then obviously there's the outright Bitcoin maxis that just say it's going to go to 0. But I think around 0.03 to 0.04 is the sweet spot for a low on the ETH Bitcoin valuation. And I think it's probably going to happen in the next few months. And if you think about it, I think some people have trouble looking at this stuff because it's somewhat abstract. What does 0.047 mean, right? But one way to think about it is to think about, and I guess you can see what happened the last time I was looking at this. But back in say December 2021, one Bitcoin would have gotten you about 11 ETH. Today, one Bitcoin gets you almost 21 ETH, right? So, I mean, again, that's why Bitcoin dominance matters. Another way to visualize Bitcoin dominance and why it's important, if you look at Bitcoin USD, it's now at 60K. if you were to overlay ETH USD onto this chart, it's at 2,900, right? It's at 2,900. Now, ETH USD is back to where it was in February, whereas Bitcoin is not back to where it was in February. So in February, ETH was at 2.9K, and now it's at 2.9K. But in February, Bitcoin was at 50K, and now Bitcoin's at 60K. So Bitcoin went up 10K from here to here, and ETH USD is at the same price after this correction. That's why Bitcoin dominance matters, right? If you're putting your dollars in ETH over Bitcoin, you're underperforming. And all you had to do was say, guys, it's tighter and tighter monetary policy. Now you might say, well, Ben, the Fed hasn't raised rates in a while, right? And so why is it tighter? Because if you think about it, when the Fed raises rates, it's not like it's immediately felt in the economy, because a lot of people already have their loans and their debt and everything at lower interest rates. But as more time goes on, businesses have to roll over their debt. People might have to just live life and take on higher rates, whatever it may be. The longer that rates stay at higher levels, the more it drags on the economy. And so you can have tighter and tighter monetary conditions, even if the Fed just stays at 5.5%. You don't have to see the Fed go to 6% for the financial conditions get any tighter. All you have to do is see them stay at 5.5%. Of course, that's assuming that 5.5% is above the neutral radar star, but I think it is. And I think the evidence is there to suggest it is, because alts are bleeding to Bitcoin. People view these monetary conditions, this monetary policy, as sufficiently restrictive. Because if they didn't view it as sufficiently restrictive, you would see more altcoins outperforming Bitcoin. But you're not, right? You're not seeing that. You're seeing them underperform. Now, there's something we talked about a couple of months ago, and it's playing out. I mean, it's honestly playing out very similar to how we talked about, and that's when you look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. Back over here, and I said this in several different videos. You can go take a look. I was just looking back at a dubious speculation video that I put out in March. And it was back when alt Bitcoin pairs were right here at 0.5 or so. And I said back then that you're likely about to see alt Bitcoin pairs crash to the range lows as we go into the halving. That's what happened, right? And then they got a bounce. But we talked about this bounce. We talked about this bounce like every single week. And even though I talked about it as the most likely outcome before the final drop, you still get people that say, well, what about this bounce? Guys, what about it? It's the same thing that happened last cycle. And if you look at ETH Bitcoin in 2019, there was a period where, just like today, ETH Bitcoin was going down and alt Bitcoin pairs ignored it for weeks, right? Here's a great example. Look at it right here. So let me actually go over to alt Bitcoin pairs. We're going to overlay ETH Bitcoin onto this chart. Okay, you see this here? So let's remove the bull market support band. And we're gonna zoom in, and we're going to look at this right here. Do you see right here how ETH Bitcoin was bleeding? And during that time, alt Bitcoin pairs were going up. Why? Well, because there's a lot of times where ETH Bitcoin is bleeding and it just ends up holding the low, right? And so, why not speculate, right? Dubious speculators are going to speculate dubiously, right? I mean, they're going to look at alts. They're going to say, well, if ETH Bitcoin holds, then that means alts, might bounce. But as ETH Bitcoin continued to bleed, at some point, altcoins finally got the memo, and then they crashed, and then they took out all these prior lows that they held as support for so long. Right? You see it? Alt Bitcoin pairs went up starting May 13th, and then they topped a month later, about June 13th. Now, guys, think about this. May 13th to June 13th. 1 month. But then 1 month of watching ETH Bitcoin mostly bleed, alt Bitcoin pairs were like, okay, we can't ignore it any longer. and then they crashed hard, and then they took out those lows. And they didn't look back until they went down to 1/4 of Bitcoin's market cap collectively. Okay? Now look at today. It's the same thing. You're seeing alt Bitcoin pairs go up, but ETH Bitcoin is bleeding. Now, when did alt Bitcoin pairs find this low? You remember the 13th? I said May 13th to June. This is April 13th. It's almost May 13th, guys, right? It's almost May 13th. It's actually going to be on Monday. And alt Bitcoin pairs are up here. Guess where that corresponds to? You guessed it. The bull market support band, which is where I said they were likely going to bounce before final capitulation occurs, right? Go back up, check back in with the bull market support band one more time, which is at 0.45, and we've already wicked up to 0.45. I mean, you can see, check back in with it, get rejected, and crash into the summer as no one cares, and no one's here to witness it. If alt Bitcoin pairs crash in the summer and there's no one here to witness it, does it actually happen? Who knows? But I'm telling you guys, this is what happened last cycle. I mean, it really is. And, you know, I've tried to do the best job I can to communicate this stuff. But it's difficult, right? Because, you know, I'm fighting an army of degens that want alt season to occur. But guys, when you think about alt season, there's a pretty clear trend. And just look at yearly candles. Look at yearly alt Bitcoin pair candles. Where's your alt season? 2017 and 2021. You had 3 red candles after this green. Green, 1, 2, 3 red. Green, 1, 2, 3 red. There's a good chance that this year alt Bitcoin pairs are just going to be red again, and that 2025 maybe they'll finally be green. Why should this time be any different? Why? I mean, this is the issue, is that people witness alt season in 2017 and they witness it in 2021. And after they witness it, they then spend the next 3 years wanting to relive it because of the great memories, right? And how much money was being made. People front run it in year 1, in year 2, and by the 3rd year, they give up. And no one cares. The social risk goes back down here. Where did alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out last cycle? Right here. After this move up, they came back down. Social risk went up. Social risk came back down. When social risk came back down, that's where alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed out. Just before rate cuts. Right? Or no, just after rate cuts. Just after rate cuts. Look at this, the same thing. Go to the lows, rally up, come back down. I think we're going to see alt Bitcoin pairs potentially bottom out this summer. And then if it plays out like last cycle, then it means Bitcoin rolls over and then goes down. And then we figure out how much damage the Fed did. Now, again, I know that last part is gonna make some people mad, but that's just what happened last cycle, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that it can't happen. I'm also not going to sit here and pretend like it can't just keep going up, because it could, right? I mean, who knows, right? But, I mean, last cycle, we know Bitcoin topped when ETH Bitcoin broke down. We know that Bitcoin topped, right? I mean, here's ETH Bitcoin. It was actually right when ETH Bitcoin broke down that Bitcoin topped, right? Same thing over here, right? ETH Bitcoin broke down right here, right when Bitcoin topped. Same thing with gold, right? I mean, overlay gold, and you'll see the same exact trend. Gold broke out back over here when Bitcoin topped. Same thing this cycle, right? Gold broke out right here, right as Bitcoin topped. So that's the thing, right? I mean, like, it's playing out very similarly to 2019, in fact. I just think no one wants to believe it because it's the halving year, right? It's impossible for that to be the case. But there's so much evidence, right? There's so much evidence to suggest it is. I talked about this yesterday. The Fear and Greed Index looks a lot more similar to 2019, right? Only 1 or 2 data points, only 1 or 2 moves in the 90s, just like this one, not like this one. Looking at year-to-date ROI of ETH Bitcoin. By the way, guys, if you like the content, give the video a thumbs up. I mean, I say it in the intro, but you know, Honestly, I'm not really getting a whole lot of views these days because it's just the same old boring crap. But if you like the stuff, give the video a thumbs up. Um, I'm really struggling with the trolls these days. So if you look at ETH Bitcoin year-to-date ROI in 2024, it's doing the same thing it did in 2019. You know, if you want to say it's the halving year, well, then why is ETH Bitcoin not doing what it did last halving year? Last halving year, ETH Bitcoin went up. ETH Bitcoin's going down. This is not the same thing. It's because monetary policy is more similar to 2019 than it is to 2020 than it is to 2020. And ETH Bitcoin is bleeding just like it did in 2019, which is why this local top here could be similar to your 2019 top, where Bitcoin just fades into the bull market support band. And it bounces off of it a few times. Maybe at some point we even go above the 8-week SMA. That's what we did last time, right? If it happened then, why can't it happen again, right? We just kind of did this for about 13 weeks. 13 weeks this time puts you out in June, which is when I said Bitcoin dominance likely tops sometime this summer. The reason why that's important is because last cycle, Bitcoin dominance topped before Bitcoin fell below the bull market support band. Bitcoin dominance, if you overlay it onto Bitcoin USD, it topped here. Bitcoin USD fell below its 20-week SMA 2 weeks later. Why? Once looser monetary policy arrived, the bid on Bitcoin relative to alts decreased. Therefore, the backstop for Bitcoin that had been there for so long was removed because now people were speculating on alts. And then Bitcoin no longer had that bid in the same way, and then it fell below its 20-week moving average, even though no one thought it would. So it's very similar. It's a very, very similar outlook. And my base case, as I've said, I think Bitcoin dominance is going to 60%. And we've gotten pretty close. We've gone to 57. But I'm telling you guys, that last move is the most brutal. Because what usually happens is alt Bitcoin pairs break down, Bitcoin dominance then tops, and then alt USD pairs start to bleed. The reason why this whole thing has been uncomfortable for a lot of people that look at the Bitcoin dominant stuff is because they're looking at it, they're seeing Bitcoin dominance go up, and they stuck with Bitcoin perhaps over altcoins, but they're like looking at some altcoins, like, well, yeah, I mean, some of these altcoins are up too, right? I mean, it's not like ETH hasn't gone up. It has. It's not like, you know, Solana or Matic or DOT or ADA or Avalanche. It's not like they haven't gone up. They have. It's just the only reason they went up was because Bitcoin went up. It was not because it was alt season. You know, people say that ETH outperforms Bitcoin in a bull market. In a QE bull market, it does. In a QT bull market, it does not. And so what happens, and this happened in 2019, Bitcoin rallied. It broke alt Bitcoin pairs down to new lows. And then when Bitcoin rolled over, the altcoins went to new lows on their USD pairs. Even though Bitcoin didn't put in a new low, altcoins did because their Bitcoin valuations were a lot lower. And if you look at a lot of these different altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs, I mean, ADA Bitcoin, how many times have I said that this thing is likely going to 400 sats back down to the range lows? And, you know, I tried to warn people, and instead, I just got an army of people mad at me and saying like it was going to hold at 800 sats. And now look, I mean, it went below 800 sats. The place that everyone, you know, my loudest critic said was never going to drop below. And now here we are. We're just chilling at 700 sats. If all Bitcoin pairs can put in new lows, why can't they on their USD pairs? Why can't they? This is the problem, right? It's playing out. It's doing what it did last cycle. It's just taking longer to do it. Instead of this taking just from here straight down, it's just taking longer. But it's still happening. It's not like it's not happening. There's just more money sloshing around. If you think about it, everything's about 3/4 delayed, right? It's about a 3/4 delay, I think, right? I mean, if you look at this, we got right here in September of 2018. Here, it took until June of 2023, about 3/4 later. So perhaps we come down here. This was September of 2019. Perhaps we come down here about 3/4 later in the following cycle. So instead of Q4, or not Q4, Q1, but perhaps in Q2, which is where we are right now. It doesn't mean you can't eventually have alt season. It just means that everyone preaching alt season for the last 3 years has been wrong. Right? When you look at Bitcoin dominance, this is alt season. This is alt season. This is not alt season. This is Bitcoin dominance going up. Bitcoin USD going up and down, because over here Bitcoin USD was actually going down when Bitcoin dominance was going up. Bitcoin USD has also been, it went up, but then it went down a little bit after March, and Bitcoin dominance still went up, right? No matter the direction of Bitcoin USD, Bitcoin dominance goes up. So if you want to take on the risk in crypto, you're better off with Bitcoin. And I've said that for a long time, but I would like to exercise some caution, more caution now, because now ETH Bitcoin has broken down. Gold has broken out. Last cycle, once those two events happened, the local top for Bitcoin was already in. It didn't mean we didn't get some crazy rallies back up. We did, and they almost put in new highs. I mean, look at this, right? I mean, we had a wick here that basically took you back up near those highs, and it occurred several months later, right? This was in August, right? So you had June, July, and then August. Here, if you look at these wicks, you had March, April. Is it going to go back up in May? I don't know. But I guarantee you if it does, people are going to lose their minds. And actually, it was precisely those 2 weeks, that 2 weeks right there, that's where Bitcoin dominance soared. Alts just could not catch a break. That was where Bitcoin soared. Bitcoin dominance soared. Bitcoin USD, lower high. Bitcoin dominance went up a lot, right? I can overlay it right here. See this? These 2 green weeks? Look at that. Bitcoin dominance went from like, from 67% to like over 71% or so in a really short period of time. In just 2 weeks, it was up like 4 percentage points. It's a huge move. But guys, it's been a long journey. I'm growing weary. I'm tired. I would love nothing more than to have a sufficient reason to believe that the dominance rally is over. But I think what's going to happen, I think people are going to look back and recognize that this is the easiest part of the cycle when Bitcoin dominance goes up, right? It's just Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio. It doesn't mean Bitcoin can't go down. I mean, honestly, I think it probably will. But being in Bitcoin over most altcoins for the last 3 years was better. You can cherry pick local lows all you want. But the reality is that alts have bled against Bitcoin. And, there are some examples, obviously, like Solana. Solana's done well since the 2022 low. But you still have to wonder, I mean, what if it's just a lower high? I mean, this was a high in 2021. What if this is just a lower high? And I know that sounds, a lot of people are not going to like that. But, I mean, ETH Bitcoin, it just keeps on putting in lower highs. Why can't Sol Bitcoin? And, I've a lot of people, when they talk about the flippening, they're talking about ETH against Bitcoin. Now people are talking about Solana against ETH. But I got to tell you guys, I've seen this a lot. And normally when people start talking about the flippening on an alt against ETH, it usually means that it's at the top of the range. And sure enough, everyone's getting bullish on Sol against ETH and calling for the flippening precisely when it was basically at the top of its range. It's cyclical, right? When ETH Bitcoin was at the top of its range, everyone's calling for the flippening again. You guys remember the merge when it was at 0.08 and everyone was calling for the flippening and all that stuff, right? It's all playing out. It's taking a long time, but it's still there. The whole thing is still there. Bitcoin dominance has never stopped going up, and ETH Bitcoin has really never stopped going down. And the critics have never shown any accountability. They just keep calling the bottom on ETH Bitcoin. They keep calling the tops on Bitcoin dominance. They get all the accolades, of course, because everyone wants to know the next 100x gem. And then before you know it, Bitcoin dominance just keeps on going higher. So those are my thoughts, honestly, on Bitcoin dominance. I did want to address the other thing we talked about with it, and that was regards to the dominance excluding stablecoins. So we've seen this play out here, where basically we saw Bitcoin dominance go up. It basically swept the high, right? It swept the high right here, right? So there's a high, and then we just swept the high. Pretty big pullback. We talked about this, right? And we did a whole video on this. Same thing, right? You go up, you then sweep the high, and you get a pretty big pullback. But then about 6 weeks later, we took out that high. About 6 weeks. So where are we now? This was this was April 13th, right? It's almost about 4 weeks. So maybe we just need a couple more weeks before Bitcoin dominance, excluding stables, takes out that high. Late May, maybe around the time the ETH spot ETF is rejected. Dubious speculation at its finest, right? I don't know. But it's playing out. I mean, it's playing out. And what's fascinating is if you look at Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance, let me ask you this. Do you think it's a coincidence that it is at essentially the exact same level it was at right here, just before rate cuts arrived, right? Same level. Exactly. Just below 60%. This is Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance. Just below 60% in both cases. And then Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance went all the way up to 74%, almost 75%. And then later on, it did go above 75%. But that includes USDT dominance. You could argue that if stablecoins hadn't become so popular, that Bitcoin dominance might already be at 60%. Because again, this was the same level that was at just before rate cuts last cycle. But remember, last cycle, USDT dominance was very low, right? In 2019, it was only like 1%. Today, it's at 5%. And by the way, USDT dominance is another reason why, you could have a local top on Bitcoin USD for a while. Whenever it hits this trend line, it's not a good thing. You can look at these dates and you can see what happened, right? But it's the exact same level. And it then broke up, and then right after that, the Fed cut. You see this? It broke up here, and when it took out, you see where it took out this range high? The Fed cut like 3 weeks later. What the Fed says today doesn't matter. Okay? They're going to cut when the labor market shows a weak data point. And there's a good chance it's going to show a weak data point in the next 2 months. Last year, the unemployment rate actually saw a pretty big jump up when we got the May data in June, right? It jumped up from 3.4 to 3.7, so 0.3. What happens if it jumps from 3.9 to over 4 on the next data point, right? The Fed's going to pay attention. And again, it could be seasonality. I mean, if you look at initial claims, though, it's starting to creep back up, right? 22,000. It came in, or 22,000 more from what it was last week. Again, we also saw an increase in initial claims last May and June, so it's not necessarily anything more than just seasonality. But that's one of the reasons why you might see the unemployment rate go north of 4% this summer. And when that happens, the pivot occurs. So I don't really care what, the Fed's saying right now, because I saw what happened in 2019. In June of 2019, they said they're not going to cut. Let me see if I can find it. Let me see if I can find it. So Fed 2019 rate cuts June. Here it is. Here it is. This is an article from June 19th, 2019. Fed indicates it will cut rates, but not until 2020. This was in June of 2019. So if you go look at interest rates in June of 2019, right there. They cut the next month. So don't tell me what, CME Group is saying about when the first rate cut's going to come, because they don't know. They've been wrong for years. I was saying they were going to go to 5.5% back in 2022, and these people were calling for 3% or 3.5% for the terminal rate. So I don't really care what these probabilities say. The Fed will react if the data comes in bad. So that doesn't mean they have to cut in June. But could they cut in July? It's possible. They could cut in June. But remember, last time it was about 3 weeks later that the Fed cut, and it was after all Bitcoin pairs broke down. They still haven't actually broken down yet, and if it still takes a couple of weeks for them to break down, I mean, you're getting pretty close to the June meeting. We will get one more labor market print between now and the June meeting. Again, I don't know. I mean, if you had asked me going into this year, I would have said they'll probably cut by June. Right now, the market says only a 3.5% chance. I think it's more than a 3.5% chance. I mean, I'm not going to say that it has to be more than 50, but I think it's more than a 3.5% chance. For July, I think there's a good chance they cut by July. Again, I could be wrong. I'm not going to sit up here and say that it has to happen. And part of the issue is that the data could suggest that they need to cut, and then they just ignore it and they don't, and then we get a hard landing. That's an outcome too. So I don't want to say with too much strong conviction of that's my belief, but it's just, if they follow the data like they did last cycle, they'll cut right after altcoins throw in the towel, because that means something's starting to break. Retail is starting to slow down and they need to start cutting. If they don't cut because inflation's still coming in hot, then you really start to risk a hard landing. So I think they should probably cut in June, but it doesn't really look like they're going to. But that's when I think they should. So we'll see. And by the way, let me clarify that. I think they should cut in June if alt Bitcoin pairs break down in May. If alt Bitcoin pairs don't break down in May, then I would kick the can down the road and say, all right, well, they need to keep going, because the degens, they got some spirit. But if alt Bitcoin pairs break down in May, then I think the Fed should cut in June. So that's kind of my view on it at the current time. Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance at the same exact spot just before rate cuts. Look at this. I mean, rally up, take out the prior high right there, take out the prior. I mean, it's the same thing. See that? It's the same thing. You get one final pullback. That's what we're in right now. And it feels weird because ETH Bitcoin's going down, alt Bitcoin pairs are going up. Same exact thing happened in 2019 right here. Because during this move, actually, ETH Bitcoin was going down. It was just that alt Bitcoin pairs were going up, which is why Bitcoin dominance had this big pullback. But then as ETH Bitcoin continued to go down, alt Bitcoin pairs got the memo, threw in the towel, and then Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance went up to 74%, right? So that's where we are. Those are my views on Bitcoin dominance. I really do hope that people have found value in this, honestly. Personally, I'm losing steam on it because, I just feel like it doesn't really make a lot of people happy for these videos. And, thanks to the people that keep watching them. I do see, it's nice to see some of the positive comments coming through. And those have been really helpful, actually. But I do hope it's been helpful. I think I'm probably going to have to rely on you guys next cycle to tell people about Bitcoin dominance, because I don't really, as I've said before, I don't really want to go through this whole thing again, So basically, it puts target on your back, right? You know, to be bullish on something like this. So, but yeah, guys, I mean, we're not that far away. I mean, I do think, you know, just a few more months, you're likely going to see this pop up here, and then the Fed pivots, and then we see how much damage the Fed did, and then maybe sometime, you know, later on, you get alt season. But I honestly think that if we do get alt season, I don't think it's going to be, you know, anytime soon. I mean, I think that we still have to go through the process of ETH Bitcoin bottoming out. We have to go through the process of what needs to happen in the global economy to make central banks pivot to QE. I mean, there's a whole process we have to go through, and we just haven't gone through that yet. So, yeah, those are my views. And, you know, as it relates to ETH Bitcoin, we saw last cycle, it really showed weakness when ETH Bitcoin broke down. And cycle before that, right? ETH Bitcoin broke down here, and it broke down here, and it broke down here. And after every time it broke down, ETH USD dropped about 70%, right? Not even including the pandemic, right? 68%. So that, you know, that's still the risk, right? I mean, that's still the risk of you seeing a larger drop by ETH USD, potentially back to its lower logarithmic regression band, right? So just be aware of that, because that's, you know, that's what happened last cycle is we saw it drop back down to the lower regression band. And, you know, in last cycle, we saw it drop down right after ETH Bitcoin broke down. The cycle before that, I mean, you can see the ETH USD drop down, had a pretty big wick down right there. I mean, it still never took out these highs. Really, I think ETH Bitcoin over here broke down right here more durably. It had a wick below it right here, I think, in June. Then it more durably broke down right here, and right after it broke down, I mean, ETH USD basically just collapsed for a few months. So I think that's kind of, I mean, I think we're in this phase, right? I think we're in this phase right here, which is also this phase right here, which is also theoretically, right, this phase right here. So I think that's what's playing out, and I think it's playing out very, very slowly. And with ETH Bitcoin breaking down, I think that it can finally happen. So we'll see. And we'll see if this continues to play out. But those are my views on Bitcoin dominance. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Give the video a thumbs up, please. I would appreciate that. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. We do have Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. So do check that out as well. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.